Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining Fielding Graduate University and the Worldwide Network for Gender Empowerment, or WING, for the webinar series, Challenging Structural Inequalities and Disparities in Women's Health, Intersections of Gender, Class, Race, and Nation. I'm Kirsten McGregor, Associate Director for WING, and this webinar is the third in a series of 3 Women in Health events. For the past decade, WING has been working on critical issues around the globe focused on gender empowerment. WING is an engaged and diverse ecosystem comprised of global members committed to research, collaboration, and action in support of women's and gender issues. Our mission is to impact change in critical areas including education, poverty, healthcare, environment, violence prevention, equality, and globalization. WING is also a UN non-governmental organization. As an international NGO, we represent global partners and contribute to issues of critical concern to the global development agenda. Today, our webinar event is titled Gender and Mental Health, Deepening the Disparities. So our agenda follows 3 general segments. First, an introduction to our panelists, which is then followed by 3 presentations, and we will then have a moderated panel discussion with Q&A. We won't be addressing questions during the presentation, but please submit your questions and we'll be sure to answer them during the last segment. So this particular webinar is extending 15 minutes past the hour to 10:15 because of the scope of this particular presentation. So to moderate today's discussion, we have Dr. Anna DiStefano. Good morning, Anna.
Good morning.
The presentation over to you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, and welcome to all of you on this webinar, whether you're participating in it live today or whether you're listening to a recording of it. It's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists to you. Our first presenter will be Margot Okazawa-Ray. Margot's a distinguished scholar activist, and I'm happy to say a colleague of mine on the faculty at Fielding Graduate University. She's a member of the faculty of the Human and Organizational Development program. Her work on social change is transnational, and she has really focused on the effects of armed conflict, militarism, and violence against women, among many other things. I'm not doing justice to Margot's breadth and depth of knowledge, but you'll experience some of that as she presents. Our second presenter will be Sue Jones, founder of Yoga Hope. I realize I should be probably advancing the slides. Sue is the founder of Yoga Hope. She teaches yoga to women experiencing debilitating life transitions. She'll be talking about something that she's developed called TIMBO, Trauma-Informed Mind-Body, to help women learn to reprogram their bodies and those bodies' conditioned responses. She's worked and works in the US, Haiti, and Iran. Our third presenter is Athena Hubbard, second lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force Reserves and PhD student in Fielding's clinical psychology program. Her research focuses on post-traumatic growth. Athena has supported her husband through 9 combat deployments. So she has a great deal of credibility in terms of her presentation, which will focus on female service members and military spouses and partners. I will ask each of the presenters to speak for about 10-15 minutes, if at all possible. I know we would like them to speak longer, but in the interest of time, we'll try to limit their presentations so that we can have ample time for your questions and some interaction among the panelists. So, Margot, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you so that you can advance the slides. Margot is going to begin speaking about gender and generational trauma in Palestine. So
Yeah,
here,
thank you. Yeah.
I'm sorry, as soon as I can get this to you, I will. Thank you very much, Margot.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the history, and then giving some, updated information. And I think my main point is that the trauma, particularly of Palestinian women and children, but of all Palestinian people in the occupied territory, is the everydayness of it. It's not just one major event, and people are suffering the effects, but it's the everydayness of it, and I'll show that a little bit later on. I do want to begin with what I think about and what Palestinian people often talk about as, the major sources of trauma. The first one, of course, is from the Israeli side, the so-called War of Independence for the Zionists, and Nakba, or catastrophe, on the side of the Palestinians. And today I'm going to be focusing on the impacts on Palestinian people. So at that time, they were um, almost 800,000 children, women, and men expelled from their homes. Or some just fled out of fear. And it's estimated that 80% of Arabs living in what became Israel were expelled or fled. There were officially recorded 33 massacres, destruction of 531 Palestinian towns, and a quote from an Israeli scholar that in almost every village occupied by murders, massacres, rapes. Um, and many of these weren't even recorded. As one knows, if you've been in militarized and armed conflict situations, most of it often doesn't get reported. Right now, inside Israel, there are 1.3 million people living, and they're referred Arabs um, living in Israel, and they are regarded as present absentees. In other words, kind of ghosts in a sense. And the rest of the refugees are inside the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and other places. And one of the big political points around any kind of peace negotiation between Israel and Palestine is the right of return, which the Israelis are refusing to grant. And then the second big one is the 1967 war. That's when East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza Strip were taken. And then you can see the figures of the thousands of homes destroyed and settlements and the land confiscation. Okay, I'm trying to turn my... Okay, so this is what the map looks like, 1946 to 2005. And you can see it's very dramatic, the issue of land. And land, of course, is absolutely about people's livelihoods, but it's also about people's well-being, especially people who have been quite a bit in agrarian, conditions, I guess. Many are farmers, etc. So when you take their land, you've actually in some ways taken their soul. So I want to just talk a little bit about what I said is the everydayness of traumatic experiences. And I think since 1947, there are, three generations, right? And maybe depending on the age, even four generations of people living under occupation. So the everydayness of traumatic experiences occur at checkpoints, are perpetrated by settlers in settlements. I mentioned the land confiscation, the water shortages, all the water is controlled by Israel, the home demolitions, lack of access to medical care, the IDF incursions into towns and villages and homes, the targeted killings, they're political killings of people, usually men, who are identified as terrorists by the Israeli government. Then the internal political struggles between Fatah and Hamas. And several years ago, 10 years ago, when I first went, as I was thinking about going to Palestine, a very good friend of mine visited me in San Francisco, and one of her observations was, "Oh, your life is so orderly and predictable." I think she spent 3 or 4 days with me, and because it is so orderly and predictable, I had no idea what she meant. I mean, it didn't even really compute. I said, "Oh yeah," it just kind of went over my head. And I've seen since then that absolutely the disorder and the unpredictability causes lots of psychological as well as physical impacts. And then that these traumatic experiences are intergenerational, right? It's passed on from one generation to the other. And I think the idea of intergenerational trauma is really interesting because in some ways, oppression or colonization is thought about as kind of an event, and then it's slavery is over, it's post-colonial, it's post-war, etc. But in fact, the trauma doesn't stop after the event stops, right? That it's passed on intergenerationally in a variety of ways, including as a Black person. In the U.S., being told to be careful in all kinds of different contexts. Just that mandate, is an example of way that ancestral trauma has been passed on to me, and then subsequent generations. So that's just a U.S. example. What I wanted to do was just show some images. And I would argue that most people in the US and most people around the world, people who have never been to the occupied Palestinian territory, can't imagine the extent of the occupation and the everydayness of the impacts, right? So this is an image of crossing a checkpoint, and you can see the people, the women trapped in this very narrow space. And in other situations, you'll see lines of cars, trapped similarly or queued up similarly. Birth at checkpoints, right? Because sometimes in acute cases, women have to get out of the West Bank to go to a different hospital, right, which they have to get special permission to do. And, the births happen right there at the checkpoint rather than having enough time to, get across. The confrontations between the IDF forces and local people. And this woman really lamenting the loss of land. Just in May of 2015, CNN reported that there were 800 olive trees that were destroyed around one neighborhood or one city in the occupied territory, and the city is Hebron. And when the settlements are being constructed, you can imagine the kind of destruction of the land and tearing up of the trees that needs to happen. So this woman is lamenting the loss of the land, and you can see how the trees have been destroyed. And this is another image that I doubt you would really see in the U.S. And this is again right in Hebron. Arabic word for that is Halil. And you see a child from little boy from the settlement and a young woman from the settlement just harassing this Palestinian woman. And this is kind of everyday occurrence. And Halil, this settlement and the town of Halil is particularly notorious for terrorizing Palestinian residents. And basically, the IDF, you can see them just standing there, and they're not really being asked to protect the Palestinians. Quite the opposite. Again, confrontations between the women and the IDF, and this is during a protest. Um, and so just, I just want to show the images so you can just get a sense. And you can imagine how Palestinian mothers telling especially their sons, to be careful, children crossing checkpoints to get to school or being harassed by military personnel as they're going to school, walking 3 miles to get to a school. You can imagine what it feels like to be a family whose family member has been in Israeli prisons, often without any specific charge, but it's called administrative detention. You can imagine families of Palestinian martyrs, Palestinian bystanders, Palestinian fighters who have been killed. And as we know, if you're familiar with armed conflict and militarized situations, when there are events that cause displacement, homelessness, the women have a double duty, right? One is making sure that their families and their communities and their homes are to the best, of their ability and circumstances protected and fed, etc., right? The second duty that they can't really attend to is dealing with their own emotional reactions to losing their homes and so forth. And I just want to mention that there have been 3 wars on Gaza, and 2008 and 2009, and the latest is 2014, this past summer, 1 year ago. And bombardment, 6,000 Palestinians killed compared to 5 Israelis and 67 Israeli soldiers, the massive destruction, and this is in a place that's a very small strip, 1.5 million residents, open prison, as described by Noam Chomsky, nowhere to go as the bombing and invasion is happening. And again, women are forced to deal with the caretaking and not able to deal with their own kind of emotional reactions and traumas experienced. So I'll just leave it at that for now and turn it over to my co-panelists.
Thank you, Margot. Perhaps, and you'll, if you'll turn the screen back to me, I can also facilitate the rest. Before I turn it over to Sue, I do want to say there's one question that I had, or I'd like us to think about as we listen to all of the presenters, and Margot, when we come back to a discussion of yours, which is you began to talk about the differences in the trauma experienced by the women and the men, the sort of double duty, as you've termed it, sort of there are parts of the experience that are shared, and then of course there are parts of the experience that are particular to women in their various roles as individual women, workers, wives, mothers, daughters. The second thing, I guess, is a question that one of the attendees asked, which has to do about the differences in response among the Palestinians themselves. In a situation like this, there are probably a variety of views about how the oppression ought to be responded to. And I wonder, and our attendee wonders, whether or not that causes a different kind of conflict or trauma when members of families or neighborhoods or friendship groups have different senses about what is to be done about the injustice. I don't know if you want to say a word about any of those now, or whether you want to think about it a little bit before responding.
Yeah, let me think about it and we can open it up and that can be one of the first questions answered.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Margot. Sue, we are pleased to hear more about trauma-informed mind-body and anything else you'd like to share with us.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. I just want to make sure you can hear me. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. And thank you, Margot, for your presentation. It's a good segue into mine. What I'm going to talk about today is what we're seeing as a potential solution for so much of the trauma in places like the Gaza Strip and Palestine and all over the world. And my presentation will talk a little bit about how and why we see it as a potential solution. So you can go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about a program that I developed called TIMBO. It stands for Trauma-Informed Mind-Body Program. It's designed specifically for women, and it comes under the umbrella of my organization called Yoga Hope. And our mission on a large umbrella definition is to empower women everywhere by making our program accessible to as many women as possible. And we do that not just by delivering the program, so we're not just a direct delivery model, but through a treat, train, retain model of care, and I'll describe that a little bit later. But let me first start by telling you a little bit about the program specifically and describe the trauma-informed and gender-responsive components of the program. So this is what you're seeing on your screen right now is the first page of what would essentially be the first lesson or curriculum session of the program. And you can see there's just some very simple ideas here. There's a quote and there's some ideas about perspective. And so this program is designed along what's called the gender responsive model. And if you don't know what that is, it just means that that it's designed with a women's, how the way in which women psychologically develop in mind. So women in particular gain a sense of their self-esteem and their sense of worth and sense of strength within empathetic and mutual relationships. And all of the learning in this program takes place within the realm of mindful discussions where thoughts and ideas are mutually shared and empathy is experienced and felt and expressed. And this further supports a female trauma survivor's confidence and begins to help her see the traumatic experiences of her life as a valuable force in helping others. So we partner with organizations that are specifically committed to empowering the women they serve through finding their voice and helping them increase their sense of agency, and so on and so forth. So we're because of our treat, train, retain model, we're a good match for organizations that work to educate, to heal, educate, and empower women globally. And we also know that the health of a woman can either negatively or positively impact their families and exponentially their whole communities. So this is what I mean when I say we can actually be part of the solution on this global epidemic of trauma. So let's just stay on this slide for a minute. This is our introduction. I don't know if you can read some of the text, but you can get an idea of how this program, how the information is delivered to the program participants. This is a research-based curriculum built upon the theory that mind-body practices facilitate long-term traumatic stress recovery. And we're seeing that that's true. I'll share some of the data later. We focus on helping women reprogram their conditioned responses. So we do that by through this program, which is a person-centered, multi-dimensional method of healing and personal transformation, and this creates new neurological and emotional and behavioral responses to internal and external triggers. And what I mean by that is any kind of trauma, regardless of the external event, is rooted in an internal feeling of helplessness. So, whether it's growing up in a war zone or having a violent, growing up in a violent family, all of the trauma response in the body is rooted and triggered by a feeling of helplessness, whether it is real or perceived. So some components of this program are we help to improve behavioral self-regulation through mindfulness, increase cognitive understanding of the developmental hierarchy of emotional anatomy disruptions. That's something we go over. Social emotional growth, promoting compassionate attunement to self and others, contemplative skills that build a structural foundation for the ability to choose responses and reactions. And this is important because when an individual's physiological, behavioral, emotional response is driven by a feeling of helplessness, choice is the number one component of a trauma-informed program. So everything in this program is based on choice. And so ultimately there's a development of a resilient worldview, confidence in life and self, as well as compassion towards self and others, that offers a sense of peace and well-being regardless of the circumstances of your life. And we see that in the women's prison here in Massachusetts. So each of these dimensions cultivates self-compassionate understanding of the root issues. This is what I'm talking about, this feeling of helplessness that underpin uncomfortable body sensations and maladaptive thoughts, behaviors, and action. And it's the foundation of compassion, self-compassion in particular, that correlates directly with an individual's psychological and emotional resilience. So when you go to the next slide, we see a little sample of the page where we're talking about how fear shows up in your body, physically and physiologically. You could see feelings of helplessness, shortness of breath, racing heart, diarrhea, restless legs, and some tools for creating space between the physical sensation of fear and the response to that physical sensation. So these tools that we teach the women are kind of like wedges that create some space in between the sensation and the reaction. And long-term healing relies on recognizing the sensations in the body and accepting them compassionately. Each body sensation correlates with an emotion or emotions, and it's from this point of origin that women can break the cycle of stress and trauma. So I'm going to I have a little illustration of the cycle of stress and trauma on the next slide. And in this illustration, really, I'm hoping it describes a little bit how this program works. So when women's bodies become wired to respond to situations with danger signals, so which is really the stress, the survival response of your body. That's something you're born with. And this is due to their histories of neglect, abuse, oppression, and discrimination, among many other factors. Each time the body responds this way, it's building a library of memories from which to reference. So if you look at here, this little green box says sensory trigger. So that's the trigger. So let's say an example would be you get an email from someone who's angry with you. So that's a very common one. But you have a history of trauma. So there's a wiring in your body that will signal helplessness, and that creates a body sensation. And when you're not aware of your body sensations, that will immediately correlate with an emotional tag, which then we judge and we resist, and that creates more sensory distress in the body. And this is the feedback loop of stress and trauma. And this happens, everywhere with everyone all the time. What our program does, if we go to the next slide, women learn and practice becoming aware of their body and their body sensations. And they choose a new experience for themselves by being able to compassionately understand and accept the body's sensations, and choose a tool that will create space between that body sensation and everything that normally comes along with that, which is the thought, the resistance, the action, which can be everything from harming yourself, harming others, lashing out. And so you see here, body sensation, there's an awareness of it, a compassionate acceptance of it, and then women learn tools to create space between the body sensation and their response. And this begins to stop the stress of the cycle of stress and trauma. And here's how this works. Every time a woman does that, she creates a new, she has a new experience. And that new experience then goes into essentially a memory bank. So we can go to the next slide. Each experience contributes to the rebuilding of what I call a new reference library of experiences and then memories. So experience becomes memory. So you look, I have all these little experience all around. All these experiences go to rebuilding a new reference library. So the next time she has experiences to reference where she can say, all right, I can choose to respond to this in a different way, and it may involve breath and some learned and more implicit. This process is knowledge and choice-based, which is important for trauma-informed, which is what contributes to making it a trauma-informed program. And it also creates confidence in the women, and the confidence compels women to help other women, which contributes a new sense of worth, and it reinforces the healing and the recovery. So that's a little bit how the program specifically works. The model that we use as an organization, we call treat, train, retain. We can go to the next slide, and we've used this model in homeless shelters and prisons, and as Anna said, in Haiti and in Iran. What that means is that the program is simple, there's ease of implementation, so that we can first train the women, treat the women with the program, and then we work to help it become a self-sustained model. So this is a peer-to-peer program. So the trauma survivors themselves, once they become trained, they become leaders in their communities offering this program, and that helps reinforce their sense of worth and propel the healing. So our model not only builds capacity, it also builds communities, and there's an exponential healing and building of resilience that kind of works from the inside out in communities. And we see specifically in our work that when one woman heals, every relationship around her can heal, and when communities of women heal, healing benefits reach far and wide. And just to close, give you a little bit of our research and evaluation process. There's a formal process for evaluation by an independent research team, which includes mechanisms to measure the impact and the effectiveness of the overall TIMBO program, and the eventual longer-term impact on the women that participate and their surrounding communities. So all of the evaluation is confidential, voluntary, and all monitoring and evaluation strategies are monitored by the Institutional Review Board of Boston University. So some general findings so far of our research is that a history of abuse is very common in our participants. A history of physical assault was reported by 50% of the women. 50% of the women report experience of sexual assault, and 68% report a history of unwanted sexual experiences. General results after completing the program: the women on average used more tools to manage emotions than prior to programming, and there was a significant increase in participants' utilization of meditation, yoga practice, and self-talk. In addition, on the next slide, we see after the completion After completion of one round of Timbo programming, the symptoms of depression, anxiety, and PTSD were significantly lower. And along with that, women scored significantly higher on a measure of self-compassion after participation in the program. And my final slide shows just a breakdown of the tools utilization after completion of the program. So after the completion of the program, we'll just wait for that final slide. The women on average used more tools to manage emotions than prior to programming. And here you can see a breakdown of the tools the women use. And these last three, meditation, yoga, and self-talk, significantly increased, especially self-talk, which we work on that compassionately talking to your body sensations. Before the program, 23%. After the program, 100% of the women were using that as a tool for emotional self-regulation. So we'll continue to work with organizations who make partnership sense for us, and I'm looking forward to seeing how our program can be part of the solution to the worldwide and global trauma epidemic. Thank you.
Sue, thank you so much. I'm going to save the questions, of course, till later, but I do want to say some things that stuck out for me. Your notion of choice as the number one component, the primary component, and you said two things that I thought were just so beautifully articulated. One about creating a new library of memories, or the importance of the library of memories that we all bring from experience to experience. And lastly, and I'm paraphrasing you here, I apologize, you said it much more beautifully about when one woman heals, all around her heal. And often we talk about the exponential effects of, a woman's education or, in economic terms. But it was interesting to hear your notion about healing as also geometrically shared with those around the woman in the community. Thank you so much. I look forward to further discussion at the end. And so now our last presentation will be from Athena. Athena, take it away.
Great. I just want to check and make sure everybody can hear me okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. First, I wanted to say thank you to the previous presenters. I'm inspired by your work and I've learned so much already. I know we're working on a time limit here, so I'll just go ahead and get going and you can advance to the next slide. I'd briefly just like to introduce myself and my presentation again. So in 14 years of clinical and experience, I have helped a variety of mission readiness. In so doing, I've worked with prison populations, military populations, civilian students, and athletes, and I am currently conducting research on service members and their intimate partners in the area of post-traumatic growth, which I hope we have a chance to talk about today. So as a childhood trauma survivor, I myself have always been deeply passionate about helping others who face similar challenges, and this has informed my life's work. I am also especially passionate about military populations, not only because I'm married to an active duty special operations soldier who has seen 9 combat deployments, but also because I deeply honor and sacrifice the commitment of all service members and their families who have made deep sacrifices to defend our country. So it is a true honor to be here with you today. Like I said, I know I'm working on a time boundary, so if there's time at the end for questions, I'll be happy to go a little bit more in depth in some areas, especially in the area of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think Sue could probably help in that area too. Sounds like she's got good expertise, but I'll probably skim over that to deal with the time boundary. So briefly, you see the disclaimer up above. I am speaking in my capacity as a student and a civilian, and my views do not necessarily represent those of the United States government or any of the service branches. Next slide, please. Okay. It is a privilege to support the mission of the Worldwide Network for Gender Empowerment and their efforts to impact change with cross-cutting measures in sectors including education, healthcare, environment, violence prevention, equality, and globalization. This content is vitally important to bring into the spotlight for not only our military populations, but to civilians as well, as it informs the ability of our military to serve to the best of their capacity and also lead healthy, productive, and fulfilling lives when they return to civilian life or from overseas. Today, I would like to provide some brief background information and demographics related to women in the military. I'd like to discuss some of the opportunities and barriers these women face in relation and access. I'd like to current military and how it's designed to both leverage women's contributions, but also limits women's ability to fully contribute and thrive. I'd like to review pathology. And finally, I'd like to contrast that research with post-traumatic growth, if we have time for that, which is one of my research interests. In this presentation, I'd also like to highlight the contributions of the military family, particularly military spouses and partners, as they are an often underrepresented population in the research literature. So I'd like to briefly spend some time about them. But first, let's take a look at some of the numbers. So as you can see, there are, in 2013, there were 1.4 million active duty service personnel, and only 14.6% of those were women. So let's think about the numbers for a moment. Only 14% of all service members are women. That's not very much, but that does represent almost 250,000 people. So to put it another way, if there is a unit of 1,000 people, only 140 of those are women. And so let's try to put ourselves in their shoes for a moment. So briefly, as we transition to the next slide, I'll ask you to think to yourself about what you think some of the biggest challenges for women in the military may be. And as you're pondering, I would imagine that some of you have thought of things like sexual violence, the issue of stereotyping, values of diversity, and barriers to advancement. And if you did, you are absolutely correct. And we'll briefly spend some time on those. So this next slide, as you can see, it talks about female officers. And women certainly do face some barriers in the military, despite the amazing benefits. So in response to the findings of the Military Leadership Diversity Commission of 2011, the Department of Defense offered several recommendations for better inclusion and support of women in the military. Let me just briefly go back to one of the bullets. Females in the officer corps are underrepresented by 35%. So that's a pretty big deal. One of the things that the Department of Defense is looking at is the elimination of combat exclusion policies and practices of the Department of Defense and the services, and they're looking for the services to be fair. So in response to the findings, and in keeping with the citizen soldier theory, the Commission proposed 2 overriding recommendations. One, that the military develop a leadership corps that is representative of the population it serves, and that it take a broader approach to defining diversity and integrating skills and assets that strengthen the service. So the good news is that the military recognizes that there is a problem for women in the military, and they're willing to take steps to address it. So as you can see, the 1994 combat exclusion policy is as such. Women, well, before I get to that, I just want to make it clear that women have a long and diverse history, proud history of serving in every conflict that America has ever engaged in. But there, like we mentioned, there are still significant barriers for women. And I'd like to read a quote from the Department of Defense from 2013, which outlines the 1994 combat exclusion policy. And the quote reads, "Service members are eligible to be assigned to all positions for which they are qualified, except that women shall be excluded from assignments to units below the brigade level, whose primary mission is to engage in direct combat on the ground." Now, there are, a lot of people have strong feelings both ways about this policy, but I of this policy as it relates to women. The fact of the matter is that women while they may not be in combat MOSs, and MOS stands for Military Occupational Specialty, and all that is a job type, in compromising positions on the ground. And they can be exposed to small arms fire, they can be exposed to ordnance of any type, roadside bombs, and all of these things. So the lack of combat training, which is, if you are assigned to a combat MOS, you get trained in combat. Now, if you are not assigned to a combat MOS, which is currently restricted to women, that lack of combat training may reduce women's military effectiveness, not because they are female, but because they have to learn the duties of combatants on the job. So, for example, if you're in a convoy in an attack and the other combat soldiers have been trained on how to deal with that attack, you may be a female within the convoy who hasn't had that training. So that puts you at a disadvantage. There are also several important things to consider about the combat elimination status for women. And those include that they have less access to equal pay. A lot of combat MOSs get special duty pay in the form of combat pay. They can get explosive pay, airborne pay, things like that. And while women certainly have the prospect of being airborne qualified, they would not get combat pay, which can be pretty significant on the course of especially the long deployments, which can last for a year or even longer. This also can negatively impact their prospects for promotion. However, I would like to say one thing about the role of women in combat roles. They do fill a role on the battlefield that men may struggle with, and this is evidenced in female engagement teams. These are especially common in the Marines and some Army units. Women also can be convoy drivers, they can work in explosive ordnance disposal, and they are extremely beneficial in the war in Afghanistan. For example, because the interrogation or inspection of women by men is culturally unacceptable in Afghan culture, women play a vital role in the collection of data, questioning, and maintaining relations in not just the combat operations in Afghanistan, but in also winning the hearts and the minds of the local Afghans. So the military's current efforts include ensuring that a sufficient cadre of mid-grade senior women enlisted and officers are assigned to commands at the point of introduction to ensure success in the long run. This may require an adjustment to recruiting efforts, assignment policies, and personnel policies. Assimilation of women into closed units will be informed by continual in-stride assessments and pilot efforts. And if anyone's been keeping up with the news, there are some pilot efforts in place. In particular, women are now involved in a pilot effort in Ranger School and Ranger training, so that's pretty exciting. So another serious problem for women and men in the military is military sexual trauma. I'll let you briefly look over the content on the slides as I speak, but as you can see, military sexual trauma not only affects women, it affects men too, and at pretty large rates. And if time permits, I can go further into this topic, or if someone has questions, I'm happy to answer about it. But the Department of Defense has recently changed the way that reporting of sexual trauma and sexual assault goes in the military. And while it may not be the perfect system, it is a compromise. And like I said, I'm happy to answer questions about that later if anyone has any. We'll advance to the next slide. Okay, so there are some pretty important barriers to treatment that I'd like to talk about, and these are not just limited to military sexual trauma. Barriers to seeking mental health treatment include the fear that the consequences of reporting mental health symptoms could negatively impact prospects for promotion, tenure, or discharge from the service. There's also a big problem with stigma associated with mental health disorders and or treatment within the service member's unit or chain of command. There's a perceived weakness by the service member or members of his or her unit. There's a perceived deficiency of competent and available mental health treatment, bureaucracy, paperwork, and lack of confidence associated with mental health treatment at VAs. And as may be the case with victims of military trauma, the victim may be assigned to the same unit as the perpetrator, and he or she may feel unsupported by the chain of command. So this creates a very interesting dynamic, especially for women in some units, in particular Marine women, 9% of all Marines. So something interesting to ponder. So to transition to the next slide, I'll say that a lot of focus in the media is on the service member, but there's also a very near and dear to my heart, and this is military spouses and partners. As I mentioned earlier, I've supported my husband through 9 combat deployments, and there are good things about that and some pretty scary things about that. But one of my biggest fears, and you can see this, I think it's on this. Right. Any of you are familiar with that? That's how they notify. Scared to introduce that and talk about some of and so here we go. Despite the amazing benefits associated with the military lifestyle, such as travel, playing a pivotal role in the support of our service members in the mission, and others, research by the Syracuse University Institute for Veterans and Military Families indicates that female military employment and being paid equally to their civilian counterparts, even though a vast majority of spouses are overqualified for their positions. And as you can see in the first bullet, 95% of active duty spouses are female. We also have a hard time completing educational goals because of frequent military-related moves and deployments. These unique stressors often lead to higher rates of psychological distress, lower levels of marriage satisfaction, and poorer physical health outcomes. Further, military spouses also have to endure the hardships of being part of a military threesome, whereby they often feel that they must bear the intrusion of the military on their relationship with their spouse, thus marginalizing the non-deployed spouse. Efforts to support the non-deployed spouse are especially help of the non-deployed members in the deployed service. Length of and deployment also plays a role until part discord from the service. PTSD in the service members, medical problems in the house have been linked to deployment frequency as well as deployment extension. Some deployments can be extended in the middle of the deployment. Compared to spouses whose partners had not deployed, the spouses of deployed service members experienced higher rates of anxiety and sleep disorders, acute stress responses, depression, somatization, and adjustment disorders. Additionally, puts the female partner at 3 times higher risk for postpartum depression. Further, having children in the home leads to higher levels of stress. Hogue et al. In 2006 found that war conflict versus partner. Those spouses whose partners have experienced depression and anxiety. So these next couple of slides are not specific to female service members, but they are important of combat trauma and the role of the military spouse. I am not sure if we have enough time to deeply get into those, and maybe one of the moderators can let me know. I'm going to.
We probably should not, Athena. Yeah, I'm sorry to say, we probably should start wrapping up, actually.
Okay. All right, then I will skip this. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. Same thing with PTSD. I'm happy to answer any questions about what PTSD is and how it can be affected by the type of traumatogen and the circumstances, especially as it applies to women. And I'm also happy to talk about vicarious and secondary traumatization that the military spouse or partner experiences. This is particularly important because recent research has shown that vicarious traumatization can be cyclical in that it can negatively impact the service member or the survivor's trauma experience, but it can also lead to healing and post-traumatic growth. And then if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer that. And to respect the time boundary, I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Athena. I'm sorry for, and thank you for the lists of references here. I think that's really very helpful. We always want more time for these webinars. We should, but it would be a bit hard, I suppose, to have us all be on for a day. I know I'm going to want to hear more about post-traumatic growth, since that's a new phrase to me personally. And I thought your comments about female engagement teams, especially in places like Afghanistan, were interesting as well. But let's see what our attendees are interested in first. And Kirsten, you've been monitoring the questions. Let's start with the one that I asked Margot to talk about, though, at the beginning, or to think about, which was the differences and similarities between male and female experiences among Palestinians, and then the differences among them in terms of kind of the most desired responses or the most preferred responses to the trauma. Margot?
Yeah, well, yes, here I am. Definitely, I think there are different impacts and responses, not because inherently there are differences between men and women, but because of the expected gender roles and place in communities. Right? So, for example, women, the important role of caretaking, right? And just having to make secondary their needs is a really important difference. Another is kind of the construction of masculinity, where men are expected to be, fighters and to confront the military, for example, head on, or any other kind of emergency situation. They're expected to deal with the physical side of traumatic experiences, right? And the women are expected to deal with the emotional side. So it's consistent production and reproduction kind of responsibilities of men and women. And I think the Palestinian people, the demographics is there's a huge number of younger people, right? People under the age of 21. And so the women are very much responsible for taking care of children and also the elderly. So the whole bundle around caretaking is important. The answer to the second question is yes, of course there are variations in how people want to deal with the occupation, with the trauma. One thing to say is there are some mental health services, but certainly not enough. And as I was listening to the presentation about yoga and then the presentation about the women in the military, but particularly about the use of yoga and psychological responses, one of the questions that keeps coming up for me, whether I'm talking to women in Sierra Leone or Liberia, Palestine, wherever, under and the U.S., right, is can we think of therapeutic responses that aren't only individual and psychological, right? Can we incorporate responses to trauma that's absolutely political, where the traumatized survivors are gaining a political consciousness as well? So I'll just respond in that way and put myself back on mute.
Thank you, Margot. I appreciate that. I don't know, Sue, if you have a response to that. One of our attendees wondered about, sort of in a bit of a contrary vein to what Margot was just saying, about how the Timbo program might be delivered to women in places like Palestine. what I hear Margot asking is more, are there adaptations of the Timbo program that would maybe add to that library of experience, a political set of experiences? I don't know if Margot meant that, but I'll add that to the sort of question or comments. People in the attendee pool are really looking at sort of your three presentations and beginning to see connections or potential connections. And I wonder, Sue, if you see any yourself.
Oh, absolutely. I think to speak a little bit to Margot's query and also to your comment about connections, it's one of the things that that we are seeing is that there's an individual's experience of trauma and then an individual's trauma response, and over time kind of development of chronic traumatic stress. But that has an effect both to the individual, inwardly and outwardly, on their social emotion, their social safety, and their, quote, social life, so to speak, which also can be a political, quote, life. And so one of the things that our program does naturally is help women learn to feel safe in a social situation, because one of the driving forces of the development of PTSD is not just the traumatic event, but then the social stigma or the stigmatization, the sense of shame. And so I definitely see lots of connections, or within the military, in Athena's presentation, like being able to heal and empower groups of women, whether they are spouses of combat veterans or combat veterans themselves, to then support their peers through this program. The healing continues on all levels. And as the healing continues, there's something called, this is a term coined by my professor, Dr. Jared Cass, unconditional altruistic love. So when individuals in a group start to develop this altruistic motivation, whether it's political or community or social, there's going to be a forward push for health and healing in whatever community they're entrenched in. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's my answer.
Thank you.
Well, Sue, I think in addition to that, to tie that in, there's a question about your work internationally, and Timbo being primarily Western oriented, and how in your work have you experienced the women receiving Timbo in non-Western parts of the world?
That's a great question, and I'm glad it was asked. The Timbo program works entirely in the realm of fundamental human emotions which transcend culture, class, race, anything. So, for instance, when we went to Haiti and we had the manual translated into Creole, and there definitely were cultural considerations that we addressed. But when we're talking about, let's say, for instance, grief, I can connect with a woman in Haiti on the level of missing a family member who's passed away, or missing a child, or feeling grief and sadness over a failed relationship. And that's the beauty of the program, is I know that whether I go to Tehran, or whether I'm in prison, or whether I'm in Haiti, wherever I am, that I can connect with another woman on the level of fundamental human emotions. And that's why and how it works.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So I'd like to ask, if I might, Athena, on two questions, if you'll follow up with two of the points I made right after your presentation. What's the connection of what you're hearing from Sue and or Margot to your research on post-traumatic growth, either on an individual level or on a group or social level, or a societal level for that matter, since we know that those who've experienced um, military conflict, either from those who've experienced it sort of in their own countries or among, as you said, service members or their spouses and partners, there's some sense of trauma there, certainly. So how does one create growth on multiple levels in those kinds of situations?
Sure, I think that is a great question. And I think personally, and I know I'm biased in this regard, but it is so important to understand all the possible effects of trauma. One, because trauma can be very stigmatizing, especially in military populations where it could, like I mentioned in the presentation, it can have negative impacts on your career, on your family, on all sorts of areas of life. So not only is it important to identify the negative effects of trauma, like Sue was talking about, the neurophysiological effects, the behavioral effects, the societal effects, the interpersonal effects, but it is so important that we do not forget that growth can come out of trauma. And there is research to indicate that between between 30 and 70%, 30 and 90% of just talking about like a torn fingernail or something like that. It has to be something that is very impactful to them, that sort of shakes them from their core. Between 30 and 70% and 30 and 90%, 30 and 90% of people will go on to develop and growth is exploitable domains, but essentially what it is someone may have an epiphany after a car wreck that they hate their job and they go on to be a mental health worker like Sue in Haiti, or they make positive reorganizations of their social circle, or they choose to get healthy after a battle with cancer. So those are some examples of post-traumatic growth. And I think that these are extremely important because, yes, while we should be treating the effects of trauma that are so painful and difficult to overcome, we also have to recognize that people who suffer from trauma are not necessarily broken. And that not only can they achieve a baseline level of functioning that they may have been working with before the onset of the trauma or the exposure to the traumatogen, they can go on to be better than that in the future. That's so important not only to military populations, but to any population, including, sexual trauma survivors or others, because a lot of times, and even I've seen it within the mental health population, we approach trauma from a psychopathological standpoint. And that can be re-victimizing to the survivor. So I appreciate your question, and I think it applies in a lot of different contexts, and we probably don't have time to get into all of them right now, but I feel like it's something that's important to explore, so I appreciate you asking.
Oh, thank you.
Anna,
Yes, I was going to ask for final comments from Margot and/or Sue, and then we'll close.
Okay. So I just want to go back to my original question about individual and collective healing, political processes, and so forth, and thinking about context. So Sue mentioned, doing her work and her organization work in Haiti, for example. But I'm now thinking about these places like Afghanistan, Iraq, where the U.S. women are talking to local women and all that stuff, and whatever they do there. But the post-civil wars, the post-invasions, the heavy-duty militarized and post-war situations, how do we need to think about those traumas and huge collective traumas, right? How do we think about those, and how can the various suggestions that were made, in what ways are they relevant and in what ways are they not? And how can we expand the models, or in fact develop very different models for a variety of, for specific contexts. So I just want to put in here the question of scale, right?
Got it.
And how do we understand scale in the context of thinking about trauma and, quote, post-traumatic growth?
Thank you. Sue, a final thought?
Yes, I would like to give a big amen to Athena's talk about post-traumatic growth, and I feel that this is where the program that that we're offering and that we're training women in really intersects with the work that Athena and Margot are doing, in the sense that there is a way when a woman feels that her sense of worth is diminished, or that she is broken because of the traumas she has experienced, she suffers, she diminishes herself, and everybody around her suffers, including her children and her family and her communities. When a woman can see that her traumatic experiences actually have value, in the sense that she can now relate to and help other women in her community, then she begins to become empowered and healed. Her sense of worth strengthens, and it has an exponential effect. So I fully believe in the notion of post-traumatic growth. I have experienced it myself, as Athena had mentioned, and I think that I will give you my personal opinion, kind of to Margot's suggestion, and to everyone else out there, is I have a tremendous amount of faith that when a group of women are put together and heal and feel empowered together and begin to feel an obligation to help, then whatever it is they need to do, they will identify and they will do it. And that's just going to depend on where they are, whether they're in Haiti, Iran, or a women's prison in Massachusetts.
So thank you. On that note, I have to say, I apologize to those of you whose questions we didn't fully address. And what I especially loved about today's webinar is the three different angles, and sort of both overlaps but also differences among us. And I hope that they've given everyone food for thought in terms of exploring these issues in the future. And I hope that you will join Wing and participate in the discussion of our webinar. Visit our website, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and also to look forward to our next series of webinars, which will begin in the late summer, early fall. Thank you all very much for joining us today.
Well, hang on one moment. There will be a recording of the event.
Right.
And that will be sent out sometime later today.
Great.
People have been asking me about that.
Okay.
All righty. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Anna and
yes.
Kirsten, can you stay on for 1 second?
Yes.
As soon as I figure out how
Anna,
to end the meeting.
I know you have a faculty meeting. So.
Okay. Thank you to all of our presenters and to our attendees. Thank you very, very much.